So good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Environmental Social Justice. Today we have Mr. Kevin Klowden. He's an executive director with the Milken Institute. So welcome, Kevin. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
And so you just came off of your annual conference. So could you explain to everyone, so they have a little background, what Milken does and what the conference is all about?
So what we are is we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit economic think tank, and our focus has traditionally been on three areas: jobs, access to capital, and health. And that everything in the end really comes down to is the idea is that we're trying to, as we've put it in different ways, build better lives for people. And it's done in a number of different ways. We have a number of different groups that within the institute in different areas of focus, and we're based in Los Angeles, actually in Santa Monica, but we have a large office in DC. We have offices in Singapore and London, and a small New York and Abu Dhabi. And in the main things for us, particularly, is finding implementable solutions to problems facing the world. And obviously we're an economic think tank at our heart, and even the issues that we deal with a lot in our DC office on health, and we have our Faster Cures, and which is our Center for Accelerating Medical Solutions, and then we have our Center for Public Health. But our focus there is always still to try and find sort of a mixture of incentives, collaboration, working together on solutions. And our global conference is something that we've now just had our 24th, and the focus of it's grown tremendously over the years, but it's intended to bring people together, to connect, to network, to spend time not only having panels and discussions, but actually networking, meeting, setting up opportunities to work and learn together to address different key issues. And there are a number of cases where we can say, that negotiations on legislation has absolutely happened. Both domestic and international at our conference. We've had partnerships on research and medical solutions, various things like that have come out of the actual meetings at our conference. We even had movie discussions and negotiations. The most famous example, if you want to talk about from an ESG standpoint, was the fact that years ago we got Al Gore to do a presentation. We talked with him and got him to do a keynote presentation at our global conference, and he did the presentation, and one of the guys in the audience was a movie producer and said, "You know what? That would make a great documentary." And so literally Inconvenient Truth came out of that presentation.
I love that.
And
the
so
Milken conference, really, you guys, the conferences are always gold, but you really have a knack for putting all kinds of people in a room. I think one time they had a quote that at each conference, there's over $38 trillion in the room, as well as the intellectual knowledge that comes out of it. And this guy that we have on screen with us today is the key factor in bringing all of these people together, whether it's people in politics, medical field, legislative field, and definitely the financial field. So I love the conference every year.
Well, and thank you, Joy. And I will say I like to feel like I factor in a bit into that. Yes, absolutely. But I'm well aware that our chairman is definitely still the name draw and on all of that. But the fact is also for us is that we did it this year in person, and it's been functionally 2.5 years if you think about it, because we normally host it in the end of April, beginning of May. Last year, we knew we couldn't hold it in person. We pushed it back to October and did it virtually. The entire conference was done virtually. This year, we looked at it. We thought about, could we do it in April or May? And we're like, no, still can't happen. Circumstances aren't good enough. And so what we did is we made a point of pushing it back to October. We did it with about 40% of our normal capacity. And we proceeded to do it with everybody had to have proof of vaccination. Everybody had to take a COVID test before they came. I mean everybody. And it's interesting when you're dealing with certain, people and, officials and their staffs and everything like that, and making sure they're all tested and they've given proof of everything. But it worked. I mean, and we had contract tracing set, we had everything set, and
Wow.
it was all there. But it went, everybody was healthy. It seemed to go really well. And that matters tremendously for us. And I think it's a lot of work to do it that way. And a number of people said that they felt like it was intimate and it was lovely, but it also, because we couldn't bring as many people in, it became an issue of like, how do you balance that out? Because you don't, it's very easy when you're doing an event, a gathering like this, for it to feel too exclusive or too high level, shall we say, to some extent. But because you want it to actually be accessible, and you want it to be able to have different people together working on issues. You want to feel like, if let's be honest, having a bunch of meetings, as Joy put it, with the people with just the asset managers doesn't really help if they're not interacting with the experts, if they're not interacting with the people on the ground, if you're not, and if you don't have those connections, if you don't have those discussions, then the whole point really about just, both bringing people together and having people meet who would not meet under normal circumstances and being able to exchange those ideas just doesn't happen. And for us, that's really important. And in terms of what we've done, both in these conferences in person, a whole bunch of the virtual programming that we've been doing, a number of the meetings we do and things like that, it's really intended so that, you get different people in the rooms. Because if you're dealing with issues of, whether it's the, as you put it, sustainability, if you're looking at it in terms of investing in the future, when we say sustainable, not just environmental sustainability, but also, economic sustainability, job sustainability, people being able to live and stay in cities and places like that, you need to have people who are both fighting that fight, they're struggling, or representing those who are struggling, and those who are
you
making a
had some
difference.
really great panels this year regarding that. The one that Tracy Gray was on, getting women involved, getting minorities involved in the money asset. You're really bringing a lot of people to the table that can speak to all of this.
And which is incredibly important for us. And I will say that the Investing in Women of Color panel was one that we were incredibly proud of. And that was the panel Tracy was on. And in fact, Forbes wrote an article basically off of that panel and interviewed all the panelists and my colleague Jean Cornelius about it. And it was really significant. And I'm happy for Tracy because I've known Tracy for years, but everybody on that panel was great. And it was really a really important thing to have that panel come together and to have a number of the others. We did a panel on, investing in the future of infrastructure, where I'm incredibly proud of the fact that everybody on that panel was either a woman or a person of color, or in or in multiple cases both, and genuinely talking about realities in a whole bunch of different places and what are the barriers, and that's really important. And for us, it's worth remembering that you can't have change if there's no access.
Exactly. One of the things when you brought up infrastructure, we have a whole host of questions I wanted to ask you, but since you brought up infrastructure and accessibility, I'm very passionate about our infrastructure and investing in the infrastructure, because we have a lot of changes that need to happen. Most of our streets and roads are in bad shape. We need to start putting in more electrical plugs. People who, I'm a big fan of hydrogen. I think we need more hydrogen infrastructure. Are you seeing that developing, after this conference? Are you seeing more push towards that?
I think that there's a recognition of that reality. I think from a sustainability standpoint and otherwise, it feels like a bit of a trap, because right now we're waiting on whatever the reconciliation bill negotiations are going to wind up at in Congress. But the physical infrastructure bill, the one that was the bipartisan one that went through, clearly has elements of it. The reconciliation one clearly has elements of it, but a lot of it, I go back. Years ago, I moderated a panel on addressing California's infrastructure needs. And I, at the time, dealt with some very high profile individuals, particularly not just in California, but from various investment funds and others in infrastructure companies. And they were saying, is anybody ever going to actually invest and fix a bunch of these things? It's worth remembering that, California into the 1970s had, the gleaming highways and new builds and new everything like that. And even into the 80s, we did a lot of that and then stopped. And I made the comment at the time that I said that the infrastructure, it only gets invested in one of three ways. It gets invested when you're building something new. If you're doing a new development, new town, new project, new anything, it gets invested when there's a crisis. Basically, when it becomes so bad that people can't ignore it and they have to do something about it. Or it gets invested in because somebody makes it their keystone pet project. That's sort of their defining issue of who they are. And we forget about the fact that one of the major reasons that the biggest infrastructure projects happened in the United States is that they tended to happen because somebody either at the federal level or at the state level or even sometimes the local level genuinely felt like and made it their pet project. New York had LaGuardia Airport because Fiorello LaGuardia made a huge deal over the fact that when he was flying back, he had to land in Newark at the time. And he's like, I'm going to build an airport in our city, and it got his name on it. I mean, so notoriously, he apparently loved the airport so much, he actually had an office at the airport and would routinely go there to get work done when he wanted to get out of City Hall.
That's awesome.
FDR and funded, pushed a number of these different projects. The Hoover Dam happened because, part because, Herbert Hoover, took what was called, it was the Boulder Dam. And he was like, he threw his weight and name behind it and his effort behind it. And Hoover was somebody who was a big believer in these grand projects. This is something that he was known for when he was Secretary of Commerce and even before that. If you look at Eisenhower, funded the interstate system and pushed it because he had been on the survey team whose job it was to go along with the Army back in the 19 teens and travel around the country and see how long it would take to move troops across the country by road, and came back and said, it took us a month. This is horrible. And that led to help lay out the standards of the U.S. highway system. And then when he was in, when he was in the government, he pushed the interstate system. And it's a lot of those. And if you look at it in terms of renewables and things like that, we don't have the energy grid we need in this country right now. We don't have it in hydrogen. We don't have it in electricity. We don't have it in terms of energy storage. We don't have it in terms of a lot of different things. And, you look at the fact that South Australia has this massive battery system for storing electricity that it went in part because Tesla at the time and Elon Musk wanted to cut a deal, wanted to do something to show this could work. And they threw a huge amount of resources and effort to making sure to get that battery system together. And it actually did. South Australia said, it's been an incredible success for them. They've actually found that having that energy storage has been greater for efficiency and savings in terms of using, stopping fossil fuel use than almost anything else. And the question is, who's going to invest in something like that right now? And we do need that. If you look at Texas and the strain on the grid, and part of that has to do with the fact that Texas literally has its own section of the national electric grid. It's basically the West, the East, and Texas. And if you look at California, we have major transmission line issues, and there's been a problem figuring out who's going to pay for it and getting the various utilities to agree on it. And everybody knows it needs to happen. The question is who pays for it, how is it done, and how do you do it where you don't make it regressive and put all these costs onto the consumers that the consumers can't afford to pay. And that is important. And you look at the fact that when you put solar in, and if solar goes on individual homes, the effect it has in the grid and and redirecting electricity and everything like that is that, the people who are incentivized and can afford to do it on their individual homes essentially get a discount relative. I mean, ironically, even compared to the people who can't afford solar, because the strain on the grid and everything like that that happens needs to be paid for somewhere, and so it gets paid in general fees, and that often goes to people who don't benefit from solar at all. And it's that kind of issue you need to be aware of. And we've got massive water needs, and we've talked about the institute before. I mean, we talked about electricity a bit. We've talked about various ways of incentivizing that. We're going to continue. I mean, just to be clear also, my group at the Institute is the Center for Regional Economics. We particularly look at this issue in terms of regional economic development and competitiveness and sustainability. This is a huge deal for us, and we look at it not just at the state level. Sometimes we'll look at other countries. We'll look at it at the national level. We'll look at it in the transnational level, depending on the scale of the issue. But this is something that profoundly needs to be addressed. And we spend a bunch of time on housing. If you want to look at something where fundamentally, even if we think about is homes as being sort of built on an individual basis, the fact is that we haven't had a local, a state, a national housing strategy for an absurdly long time. I mean, think about the last time there was a national housing strategy, and at all there was and that was basically the GI Bill and the incentivizations that came out of World War II. The house I live in was originally built as sort of an outgrowth of that. My whole neighborhood very much developed right after World War II, either during and after World War II, because of things like that. There are neighborhoods all around this country that are like that. And some of that was a reaction to issues during the Depression. Some of that was issues in terms of this idea that we were rewarding soldiers and others and saying, you can have that life. You can afford that, once you're done serving your country, you can have that. We don't exactly do a lot to incentivize veterans in this country, which is why, we make a big deal about them. We don't pay soldiers enough when they're in the military. We train them incredibly well, but we don't teach them how to translate those technical skills into the private sector. And then we don't house them afterwards. You think about that in LA, there's the whole encampment of veterans literally living right outside the federal lands in the VA by Wilshire Boulevard in San Vicente. The horrible irony, that land was originally donated specifically to the U.S. government for veterans housing back after the Spanish-American War. And it was never built.
That's not good.
No, that's not good. That's not good. And that most of that
land's being wasted. It's a lot of land. It's a lot of land if it was developed right.
And and it looks like that's finally going to happen. I mean, it's that this is finally moving. But this is the thing: is that recognizing and investing in that in saying if you're dealing with these issues, it takes a whole bunch of groups working together. It takes neighborhoods recognizing that they need to play a part in build housing and allow housing. It takes limiting regulations so the cost of building that isn't so high. It takes expediting the permitting on it so that it can be done in a reasonable time, so you're not stuck wondering, can I do this for a few years? I mean, one of the reasons people talk about with China, is that there's a trade-off. China has built some infrastructure projects that have had very clear negative economic, environmental, social consequences because they rush them through. But they've been able to rush them through. They'd be able to get them done. When there's, when they wanted to build HighSpeed Rail, they have, they went from nothing to the most extensive HighSpeed Rail network in the world. And they just said, we are going to make it this priority and we make this happen. We don't, we keep talking about HighSpeed Rail and then, nobody talks about it. The groups that would actually benefit, the locations that would benefit most from HighSpeed Rail, if you build it right, aren't the big cities. It's the small and mid-sized cities. It's the surrounding communities. It's the ability to, if you want investors to be able to get to somewhere, you want to be able to facilitate, for somebody to get to Des Moines. You want to be able to get them to get to Fresno. You want to be able to do that and not have to pay an obscene amount of money to fly into a small airport and have a hard time getting there. And you want people in the surrounding communities to be able to say, I want to live, further out. You want a city like Bakersfield to thrive, and Bakersfield is very well positioned in a lot of ways in terms of where it's located and what it could do. But Bakersfield hasn't had a rail link into Los Angeles since 1971.
I know that transportation is a touchstone for Joel, because Joel's lived in many major cities, and city of LA is just not well organized for our current transportation system.
No, it's a hot mess.
It's a hot mess, yes.
Well, if you think about it, I mean, sorry to go on this, but LA has two major problems. The first is that we had a transit system, and we allowed it to basically be taken out by the private sector because we were, public officials were somehow convinced that mass transit should pay for itself, which it only does when there's no competition. Or very limited competition. There's only two places in the world that I know of where mass transit turns an operating profit, and that's urban Japan and Hong Kong. That's it. And a lot of that is because in Hong Kong, think about the size of Hong Kong. Think about it's got the mountains and everything else. The way there's not a place to build those roads, and the mass transit makes a huge amount of sense. And in Japan, they made a conscious decision after World War II, where they invested in rebuilding the rail network first over building highways, and they've consistently done that. And both the subways and the national rail system actually turned an operating profit. They have private railways in an extensive way in Japan that make money. They're sustainable. It's only when you get out to the outlying areas, out into the more rural areas, where they really need government subsidies and help. But in LA, we didn't recognize that. We let the red cars and the various other, streetcar systems get taken out. We gave up the right-of-ways, which is insane. And then we waited too long, basically, to build a rail network. But the other problem is that LA downtown is there artificially. If you think about it historically, based on where LA is located, downtown should be on the west side or Long Beach. It just, it should either be down by San Pedro and Long Beach by the harbor as a port city. Think about how San Francisco is set up. San Francisco's downtown is located based on where the wharves were back in the late 1800s. Otherwise, but what happened is that downtown Los Angeles was literally cited based on a compromise to build a market town in between Mission San Fernando and Mission San Gabriel.
So for me, it's and I'm sorry to interrupt you. Yeah. Like my issue with the transportation in LA is I don't care where things are located. I'm just going to be perfectly frank, and I think it's fascinating to know the history of it. But what they're trying to do now is not look at the way LA is currently. LA is not one city. It is about multiple cities combined that we all call as Los Angeles. So the system that they're putting in now is just these offshoots that are going from downtown. But what do you do once you get there? This is not a very easy place to walk around. If you're getting into Santa Monica, it's not easy to walk around. If you're trying to get to downtown or out to the valley, you're not going to be walking around. And so you got to create this system that kind of branches off and creates things. And nobody's looking at it as to say, we need a system that goes around the San Fernando Valley, and then we connect that to downtown. We need a system that goes around the west side, and then that gets connected to downtown. Well, so it's like there has to be this central hub that all these other hubs are connected to. And that, at least to me, that's what makes sense. But that's not the way they're looking at it. They're like, oh, just plop a line down here and then people can walk. Or they're going to drive their cars to park there, but we're not going to give you ample parking. And then we're going to charge you extra. And it's just it makes no sense.
Well, it doesn't make any sense. But the reason I was doing with the history thing is because the LA plan is based on this idea that downtown is where everybody needs to go to. And that fundamentally it's based from the 1950s. Seriously. The layout in terms of the rail rail layout, the lines, everything is based on a 50s layout. The truth is that right now, the biggest commute patterns are from downtown to the west side, from the valley to the west side, and then all along the south, sort of the South Bay corridor and otherwise. The single busiest, last time I checked, the single busiest point in freeway traffic in the greater LA area was actually where the 405 and 605 meet, right at the edge of Orange and LA County, just because of all the split offs of people going to different locations and coming together. And you're right. I mean, we don't have that. We don't have that that sort of that local setup. But we also don't have we didn't prioritize building the lines between where the people were actually going, because we didn't have the right of ways. It was harder. Setting up was harder. Planning it was harder. And the first mile, last mile problem is huge. And we didn't set up places for buses to sort of hub out of. At the rail stations, which is something they do pretty well in Washington. They do amazingly well in London. Quite honestly, you go to London and you get at a station and they have maps showing you exactly which bus you can switch to, which will get you to your local spot, all over the place. And the system feeds and it works. And, Washington, D.C., I always liked how that worked, because D.C., the rail network is like LA's. It's too spread out. It doesn't get you exactly where you need to go. So you have to look at a bus. If you've ever been to DC and you want to go to Georgetown, they specifically blocked the rail line even going into the neighborhood.
I lived in DC for many years, and the thing that I loved about the Metro line there is that DC is its own little hub. It is its own little enclosed city. It is surrounded by all these different suburbs. So the Metro system that actually runs through DC, your stations are a few blocks apart. So you can walk them. You can actually get to and from. I mean, it's when you start getting out into the suburbs, it creates a different issue. But when you're in DC, the Metro system is actually very concise and it works very well. It's like, but what they're doing here in LA is like, oh, we're going to put a station here and then, 8 Los Angeles blocks, which is very different than a DC or a New York block system. We're going to put that another 4 blocks away. So you're actually adding a good mile walk between people. And it's like, what are you doing? Like, this makes no sense what they're creating here. It's completely backwards.
Well, it's because it's driven by cost limitations. What happens is that, and part of the problem with LA and part of the problem you're dealing with is that when you have fights over there are 2 different fights that happen. One is where the lines go, and 2, how much money that line is going to get. If you look at, for example, the purple line / whatever they're calling it now, the line they're building out to Westwood. That line is supposed to go into Santa Monica. It makes a huge amount of sense for it to go further along and to actually get into Brentwood, get into these areas where there's a lot of people employed. But the reason it's not is because they built the Expo line first. And the Expo line managed to make it out to Santa Monica. And the people in these other places are saying, no, that's way too much money. That's way too much problem. It's like, stopping and telling people, you do realize a large portion of your population actually would benefit from a line like this because they commute there from where you live in your neighborhood. But that's the problem. It's all about, doing things, throwing money out to a certain amount. And every time you build a new station, stations are really expensive. And every time you build a new station, then you run into this and you run into that problem. And you're right. In Washington, if you look at it in New York, if you look at it in London, if you look at it even in Chicago, they all do a concise central location with stops very clustered, and then they spread out. And that's part of the issue we run into. And, one of the things that they found in a number of places is that they have to go back and add stations. You actually have to put things in later, and that costs a bunch of money. And how do you get it through? But the first mile, last mile issue, that issue of, that you should have parking at the stations, especially if people are commuting in, that, that you recognize that this is always going to be an issue, and not the current head of Metro, not the immediate previous head of Metro, but the head of Metro before that, according to what I was told more than once, vetoed putting more parking at the stations because he's like, well, that's not what the future is.
Well, what is the parking at the stations right now anyway? It's like somewhere between $6 and $8 to park all day. So you've got to pay for your
I think it's
ticket.
It's not even that. You have to get. I mean, because when I was in the Valley, and if I was wanting to get downtown, I would have to get to the station so early to get
Yeah,
to
I feel
parking,
like
because otherwise you're spending like all this time trying to drive around this limited space to even find parking. Then you've got to, so once you get that, then you've got to walk to the station where you're stuck waiting on a train to come to get, it's time wise, it makes no sense.
Yeah.
It makes
it does take a
no
while.
cost
Yeah.
wise.
Whenever I have used the Expo line to go places, I figured out which stations have parking and which ones don't. And that doesn't mean it's the most convenient station for me. I
Yeah.
just know which ones actually do because they built more parking. And I know that I've flirted with this, that some of the stations, they have a system where you can buy monthly parking. You can get it discounted by that way, and it's supposed to prioritize you. And they're trying to address that, but it's a fundamental need to overhaul a lot of that, and then to figure out where does the money come from to subsidize that, and where does the money, in recognizing part of the real problem ultimately with mass transit, and it's going to continue to be this, is that your mass transit the key to success of mass transit is having the middle class use it,
Yeah.
because
Let's
that's the
understand that.
critical.
Yes.
That's the
Right.
critical issue. It's critical numbers. It's the critical amount of money that goes into it. All of that. But if mass transit tends to rely on people who are poorer and have no other options, when California issued driver's licenses to illegal immigrants, the number of people taking mass transit dropped and never recovered all over the state, because suddenly people who were illegal immigrants realized they could get to their jobs faster. They looked at the amount of money spent, they looked at the circumstances, and they said, if I have an old car and I'm willing to pay for gas and I'm willing to do this, I'm better off doing this. I know I'm not going to get fired because of because I wasn't able to get if I missed the train, or I missed the bus or anything like that. But the buses are really the ultimate issue. Is that the point of buses should be to feed people into the rail network. That you basically you switch modes of transit maybe twice. That's it. If you do anything more than 2 switches, people won't do it. They just won't.
Yeah.
It's not possible. It's not viable, and the chances of missing a connection, the chances of things happening, just degrades and collapses. And it's a rethink that we need to do. And part of it is also this recognition. It comes down to, even on a national level, where this failure to understand that everything is ultimately about building those connections, that you need the rail networks between the cities to feed people in to the cities, that's something they used to do and we let it be neglected, that highways don't really do that in the same way, and that you need to have networks in the cities to get people to where the jobs actually are, the resources actually are. Yep. And you need to recognize that having these different elements creates benefits throughout the system. I mean, look at, the fact,
for us, we're a car culture. So I think the biggest shift is like, it's great if we build all these systems in. We have to make a cultural shift to get out of our cars. Because I remember when they were widening the 405, I believe the study was when, 1 out of 10 would be willing to give up their car for public transportation. That's a problem that we have here. It's great if we build all this infrastructure and we do all this, but if we can't get people out of their cars, it's not going to work. And that's the shift that has to happen first.
But if people can't get to their jobs, or they can't get to shopping, or they can't get to anything, they won't give up their cars. And that's part of the problem with it, is that there are numerous studies that look at, in terms of network complexity, that the more different branches and the more you're able to get that last mile problem solved, more people are willing to get out of their cars. And it's that issue, is if you don't address that, if you don't solve that, then people won't make the switch. It's not even just a matter of culture. It's simply a matter of, they'll try it once or twice, and they'll say, this is awful. This is, and they won't. And the fact is that, they ran into this in London when they privatized the rail networks years ago. They partly did it because it was clear nobody was investing in Brit Rail. At the time, it was viewed as a joke around Europe. It was considered horrible, and they needed ways to bring money in and all that. And what they found was that on the rail networks where there wasn't reliability, or there wasn't enough capacity, that more and more people gave up and took their cars. They just said, even if they had been living for years doing rail, they would give up because they're like, I missed these meetings. I missed these circumstances. The range of how long it takes me to get can vary into the city can vary by up to an hour. That's unacceptable. I mean, an hour difference is insane. And so what you wind up with is people, who walked away from it. And then when they fixed a number of problems, it took a lag time for people to get back and use the system. And right now with COVID, the fact is that there are tons of people who are incredibly paranoid about going on mass transit. New York, New York went overtime to, enforce the masks on the subways, masks on buses, etc. And then you get incidents like the cops not wearing the transit cops not wearing masks, who harassed the person who was saying, "Why aren't you wearing your mask?" And that undermines confidence in the system. And the fact is that it's not, about freedom. It's not about, it's not about this. It's about feeling safe and feeling something's reliable. And that's true whether it's mass transit. That's true about when you switch to an electric car. If you live in an apartment and you don't have an incentivized way of charging your vehicle, and you have to fight and fight in order to be able to do that, and just for an apartment, you're not going to get an electric car. And if you're going to, we talk about, hydrogen infrastructure. Toyota put a bunch of money in so that they could get people to drive hydrogen cars around California. But people don't buy that many hydrogen cars because there's still not enough stations. Nobody else has put enough resources into it. And the truth is that where hydrogen really is important isn't for individual cars. It's there for fleets. It's there for trucks. It's there for mass transit, for buses. It's there even for, they're seeing evidence that it could be really good for trains and for other uses. But the issue is, you have to put the infrastructure to fit where the demand is. Now, Toyota actually happens to be a company that has a whole truck division called Hino, and as part of their, they could actually do that. And you can see the market for it. Will they? Who sets that up? Who makes that possible? And how that goes and how it gets set up could be incredibly important. And that's the kind of distinction that we all need to see and have. That's the kind of circumstances that you need people to recognize the benefit from it. And the problem with a whole bunch of these things is it's putting a bunch of money in now for benefits that are going to take a number of years to come together. And we're all horribly impatient because we're all looking at it and saying, our lives are miserable now. Well, our lives are going to be more miserable if, the coast floods, and they're more miserable if if traffic continues to accelerate and you can't, and your hour commute becomes 2 hours and various things like that.
Look at the 405. The 405 was widened throughout the San Fernando, throughout the pass to get through there, it's like 10 or 12 lanes wide now both ways. And the whole premise was, this is going to cut traffic down. Well, that's great. It did for when it was constructed, but the long-term effect is there's more traffic on it now than there was before. So it's like this whole thing that's just being built in. It's like, okay, let's look at the immediate needs. Well, what do we need now? Not what do we need 10, 20, 30 years down the road.
But we're not going to get there. Everything takes I just spoke to somebody recently in anticipation of the COP26 conference happening in Glasgow, and they're presenting on a just transition. And basically meaning, equitable transition, which is a lot what Kevin does with respect to the competitive regional economies, which, correct me if I'm wrong, this is not my forte, but it's basically making everything accessible to everyone and including people in an equitable fashion. Is that a correct statement?
Yeah, it is. And it's in equity, not just in terms of individuals, but equity in terms of communities, regions, places, we suffer right now in this country. Is that one of the real reasons that, we're having this spike in global emissions right now, leading up to COP26. We're seeing all these different things because what happened is that we allowed so much of the supply chain, of manufacturing, of resources to dwindle during the pandemic. And then everybody, as we came out of it, has been coming out of it. And it's not over yet, but still people are acting that way. They want what they were missing. And so we've worked overtime. We've pushed this. we keep forgetting in this country that, and it's not just unique to the US, but we very clearly see it here, is that there are two extremely disparate locations that fundamentally suffer from neglect and poverty. One of them is, are basically aging urban core areas, especially ones that depended on where people were lured in decades ago because of manufacturing or various jobs that don't exist anymore, opportunities that don't exist anymore. Especially portions of the U.S. that had benefited from the Great Migration and various other issues, or developed even before then, and developed in between the wars, between World War I and World War II. And you compare, and then the sort of the rural areas, these areas that have never adapted, they're dependent on agriculture that's increasingly corporatized. They're dealing with, limited amounts of investments and opportunities. And if those things don't come together, those places suffer, and they very clearly do. And so the problem is that we have very different perceptions of people in those locations. We have very different, communities. They tend to be represented by different political parties, but the same needs are there. Those, those needs of those lack of education, the lack of opportunity, the lack of investment, the lack of healthcare. I mean, if you look at the devastation in terms of hospitals closing both and not being in demand, both in urban communities and in rural communities. We've seen more hospitals close in rural communities, and they were closing during the pandemic.
Yep.
Because they couldn't do the elective surgeries they needed to essentially subsidize themselves and stay going. It's that reality is that is that you have two communities who really should be united in saying we're not getting what we need.
Absolutely.
But they aren't being treated that way. They aren't being recognized that way, and it's a huge problem for us that we fundamentally need to deal with. And it's something we're trying. I mean, it's something we're very mindful of. And I think that one of the negative consequences that we get, not just in the U.S. and the political divide in the U.S., but we have between different countries, is that people fall back on this zero sum game thinking. This idea that if I get something, somebody else has to lose something, or vice versa, and not and the problem is in the end that it's more of a prisoner's dilemma. It's more of a thing is that everybody benefits in the short term if they go on their own, but everybody benefits a lot more and more sustainably on the longer term if they work together.
Yeah, and that's something we actually have a hard stop at the 45 mark, but
sounds great.
Just closing out, I agree with you. We all need to get political parties aside. Let's forget about that. We all move towards the same path in the same direction, and we need more collaboration. We need more people, not fighting internally. Is it electric? Is it hydrogen? Is it this? Is it that? Some people want nuclear. I don't get that personally, but I'm willing to learn. But we all have the same path. We all need to move forward, and it also needs to be very equitable. Everyone needs to be included, not just the investors, not just the people in super high-ranking positions. We have to start helping each other. In closing, though, with Milken, with the work you're doing, what can we expect in the immediate future? What are you guys working on that we can look forward to?
Well, we're continuing obviously to work on housing. We're absolutely working on issues of capital access, particularly looking at capital access issues for minority businesses. We've got a large project we're doing right now, particularly that's focusing on in California and Texas in that regard. We've got work that we've been doing on the Central Valley and water and sustainability. We've got things that we're intending to do on a whole variety of different issues, including potentially trade and exports and access to capital, once again, for SMEs and particularly for minority-owned businesses. We've got and that's just in issues on infrastructure, and we've had multiple ones we're looking at there, and that's just tied to my group, let alone what we're doing more broadly in terms of looking at lessons and outputs from in terms of health, and in terms of looking at it, what went right, what went wrong in terms of what happened during the pandemic, looking at various collaborative efforts on issues there, some broader issues, and we've got an initiative that we've been launching at our DC office, looking at investing in minority depository institutions and seeing if we can help and expand that. There's a lot, and those are just a fraction of what we're doing.
And before Joy jumps out, because she's got a 9:45 call, she gave me the heads
I have to
up.
go. I'm actually doing an energy panel down at Disneyland. So
that sounds marvelous.
Are a whole different beast, but
all right.
Yeah.
Well, you can ask them about that non-running monorail. I
want the monorail back.
Yeah.
Okay, Joy,
they don't trust the air filtration system in it with the pandemic, I think, is what it comes down to. But anyway, have a wonderful time. I've got to go also. I'm actually talking to the Commerce Department in 15 minutes. So
awesome.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. You're a wealth of knowledge, and we look forward to everything in the future. Guys, check out their conference, Milken Institute. I believe it's going to be in May or April this year, or
it'll be beginning of May. So it'll be the very beginning of first week of May. You can look at milkeninstitute.org, or you can look for both highlights from this year's global conference and what's going on for next one at globalconference.org.
Wonderful. Thank you guys so much. Everyone have a wonderful day. This was fantastic. This was fantastic. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Take care.